Hello, good morning. Be very welcome to our Cambridge Experience event.
Das ist die 4. Veranstaltung der Cambridge Experience und sie wurde mit Aufmerksamkeit vorbereitet.
El evento es promovido por el Centro Abierto Farroupilha con el apoyo de la Universidad de Cambridge y la Escuela de Professores Inquietos.
Il tema di questo incontro è plurilinguismo e competenze interculturali, abilità fondamentali per il cittadino globale contemporaneo.
所以我们以很特别的客人和演讲者的存外长指望。
Join us. Send your questions through the chat.
Novo sou atua boa e vermelho.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Luciane Calcara, the manager of the Cambridge and Foreign Language Center at Colégio Farroupilha. The Cambridge Experience event has been taking place since 2019. It brings together speakers from around the world and permits an exchange of experiences among English language teachers, students of languages, principals, managers, and other educational professionals. Today, in its 4th edition, the event proposes a discussion on the theme of plurilingualism and intercultural competencies, the fundamental skills for the contemporary global citizen. The guest speakers today are Nick Saville, Director of Thought Leadership for Cambridge English, and the elected General Secretary of the Association of Language Testers in Europe, ALTE. Silvana Richardson, Head of Education at Bell UK, Academic Director at Bell Teacher Academy, and a Strategic Education Advisor at the Bell Foundation. And Alberto Costa, our Cambridge Senior Assessment Services Manager for the Americas. We are delighted that you are here and we hope you enjoy the event.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Roberta Lima, Business Development Manager for Cambridge University Press and Assessment in Brazil. Our event has simultaneous translations to Portuguese. To activate it, just choose the Portuguese option in the menu at the bottom of the screen. It's very easy. You just go to interpretation, choose Portuguese, and then you can listen to all the presentations in Portuguese. During the event, it's possible to submit questions in the Q&A box, please, through the chat. Due to time restrictions, it may not be possible to answer all of them, but we'll try our best to pass all the questions to the speakers and answer all of them. At 11 a.m., we'll also have a short 15-minute break so everyone can stretch their legs, make a coffee or tea, and check your messages, and then be back because you can't miss any part of it. The certificate of participation will be available for everyone who responds the survey, our evaluation survey. It will be sent on Monday to the email you used to subscribe to register for Cambridge Experience. Our first guest speaker is today's Alberto Costa. Alberto is the Cambridge Senior Assessment Services Manager for the Americas and has been at Cambridge English for 6 years. He has a solid English language teaching background and has worked as a teacher trainer, and academic consultant, having also worked as a course tutor for the Cambridge Teaching Qualifications, CELTA and Delta. His main interests include language assessment and continuing professional development for teachers. His chosen topic today is plurilingualism and plurilingual skills in the light of the Common European Framework of Reference. Welcome, Alberto. It's a great pleasure to have you here with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Roberta. Thank you very much, Maricia, Luciane, and all the Colégio Farroupilha team and Farroupilha Open Center as well. And most of all, Thank you everyone who is here on a Saturday morning attending this series of sessions, which we hope will be a great opportunity for professional development to all of you. Well, I will be delivering a very short talk today, and my focus will be on plurilingualism and plurilingual skills in the light of the Common European Framework of Reference. Last year, 2021, marked the 20th anniversary of the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. And now, for this Cambridge Experience event with Farroupilha Open Center, we are going to talk about the legacy of the Common European Framework, which was launched in 2001. So a lot of the information I'm going to provide today will be related to the changes that have happened in the past 20 years. And I also hope to pave the way to the upcoming talks delivered by Silvana Richardson and Nick Saville, who will also make reference to this very important document that made a big change to our lives as teachers, because ever since the launch of the Common European Framework, a lot of things in language teaching were impacted. For example, materials development, curriculum design and development, teacher training, and language assessment. So here we're going to travel for the past 20 years talking about some of these changes, and of course highlighting the importance of plurilingualism and plurilingual skills, which are present more and more in the new version of the Common European Framework, which was launched in 2020. Okay, so we're going to start by talking about the previous document launched in 2001. As I said, it caused this revolution in language learning, teaching, and assessment, right? And 2 years ago, there was the launch of the new version of the Common European Framework. It's actually called CEFR Companion Volume. Those sources are available for you to download from Google, for example. Just type CEFR Companion Volume, and you will be able to access the latest version, which you can see here on the right. So during these 20 years, a lot of things happened in language teaching. When the document was launched 20 years ago, one of the main, the most important legacy of this document was the categories of levels. Nowadays, we talk about language levels and language levels of proficiency using those numbers and letters that you can see here on the left. And we now have a very clear category of language users. They are classified into basic, independent, and proficient users, all aligned with a specific level in the CEFR. And there is a clear description of all the competencies the language users have when they reach certain levels of the Common European Framework of Reference. Actually, we have a series of documents which are related to the CEFR. One of them is the global scale descriptors. You can see here an example of the global descriptors in Portuguese, which you will be able to download from this link. But you also have the global descriptors, the general competencies for the different levels in different languages as well, right? So one of the things also that are important to mention about the CEFR in 2001 was that the view of language was different from the view of language nowadays. Here we can see a table of the self-assessment scales with specific descriptors for the different skills, and language at the time was viewed like this. They looked at language in terms of understanding language, listening and reading, communicating or speaking, so we have spoken interaction and spoken production, and of course writing, and writing was only one single category. We are talking about a time when the way we communicated in 2001 was very different, and it reflected the way we communicated before 2001, because before the launch of the document, there were at least 3 decades of research that led to this moment in 2001 when the CEFR came into action, right? So this is a task for you, and I would like you to use the chat for this. We are talking about 2 specific moments, 20 years, 2001, 2022, the moment we are now. What do you think has changed in terms of language and in terms of how we communicate? Can you please add your ideas to the chat? Because then I would like to see how you understand the changes in the way we communicate. In the meantime, I'm going to give you a hint, right? Please feel free to populate the chat with your ideas. Just to give you a picture of life in 2001, this is the kind of device we used to use. So from this device, if you remember using it, there were lots of limitations in terms of communication when we compare with the way we communicate nowadays. So, for example, I'm going to give you a timeline of some of the changes that happened. For changes in technology, I gave you an idea of the kind of device we used to use at the time. So the previous document, the one on the left, had references to things like postcards and public telephones, right? Also, now, one of the big changes that we can see from the old to the new document is the focus on phonological control. The previous document didn't bring the descriptors for phonological control, as we can see in the new document, right? So there is a focus on a number of features related to phonology, for example, sound articulation and prosodic features, which are important for you to convey your messages, for example. Another change that we can see is the modality inclusive descriptors. Of course, with the devices we use nowadays, language is multimodal. We use images, text, moving images, and a number of resources to communicate with different people in different ways according to different preferences. But also, the new document on the right will bring descriptors which are applicable to users of sign languages, right? So this is very important for the hearing impaired population and the people and professionals who communicate with this audience. And we also have one important change as well, is the term native speakers. This term, when we look at the new document from 2020, it was dropped. Now we don't refer to speakers of languages as native speakers, non-native speakers, but we refer to them or to us as language users or language signers or interlocutors of the language and target language, right? So the category now is language users, and this is what we all are in many ways, in our language, in additional languages as well. So this is, a quick walkthrough of some of the changes that you will find in the new version of the CEFR, hence the new document companion volume, right? The other thing that we can see as well is the view of language. I showed you 3 key elements from the previous document. Now the elements, when we look at language, are reception, which includes oral comprehension and reading comprehension, production, communicating oral production and written production, right? Interaction, and this has a very important change here. There is oral interaction and written interaction, which also includes descriptors for online interactions, and also this very important category, which is mediation, right? Mediation basically has to do with our ability when we are talking to people through different means, speaking or writing, etc. It's our ability to convey messages. So we could be mediating a text, Maybe I'm reading something that is related to my area of study and I am talking to someone from another area and I need to mediate the content for them. Maybe it has to do with mediating texts from different languages, right? We also have this area of mediating concepts. So it could be the fact that the teacher is conveying certain concepts to learners, right? And then the teacher needs to mediate, or maybe users of language mediating concepts in different languages or in their own languages with people from different backgrounds and different ideas about certain topics, areas of study, for example, and mediating communication in general, rephrasing or paraphrasing or organizing your discourse so that message is more clearly conveyed. We are going to look at some of those concepts with a few examples, but please remember that these are just examples, right? So an example of mediating a text includes, for example, passing on to another person the content of a text which they do not have access, so they cannot see or they don't have the text at hand at the moment, so you mediate that content. Also mediating a text for oneself. For example, you are attending a lecture and you are making notes for future references or making notes of what you understand from that lecture, for example. And then mediating concepts that has to do with facilitating access to knowledge and concepts for others. When we are talking to parents, we change our language and the terms we use so that we are more clearly understood. And also situations when you need to adjust language. Parenting, for example, when parents talk to their children, they adjust language. If you are mentoring a new professional in your school, if you are mentoring a new, a person who's coming to work with you, for example, and also teaching and training has a lot of concepts that we need to mediate as teachers or as teacher trainers, for example. And when we mediate communication, it has to do, and this is just one example, right? It has to do with facilitating, understanding, and shaping successful communication between users or learners who may have individual, social-cultural, social-linguistic, or intellectual differences. And one important word here is social-cultural. When we are talking about our culture or trying to understand the interlocutor's culture as well. And this has to do with a very important point that we're going to mention here, which is plurilingualism and multilingualism, right? So here I have, just to illustrate, some descriptors of mediation at level B1+, and I'm going to show you the descriptors for processing text in speech or sign language, and processing text in writing, just for you to have an idea. But my invitation here is for you to go to the document, Companion Volume 2020, and explore the descriptors and see how you can incorporate these descriptors in your teaching practice, in your assessment as well. And of course, making sure that you address all those features of plurilingualism, pluriculturalism, and mediation as well. Just to give you an example, at level B1+, you are expected to summarize in a language or in your own language the main points made in long text to another language, or grading the level on topics of your fields of interest, provided they can check the meaning of certain expressions. You need to demonstrate that you can summarize in a language or in your own language a short narrative, article discussion, and answer questions about the details, right? And that you can collate pieces of information from different sources and summarize them for somebody else. And in terms of writing, it has to do with summarizing in writing, in your language or in other languages, the information and arguments contained in texts, and on subjects of general or personal interest. So this is just to give you a taste of some of the descriptors that you will find there for mediation. But we also have other areas to consider. As I mentioned, one of the highlights of this document in 2001 was to bring the aspect of multilingualism and plurilingualism to the discussion, the world communicating more and more through different means and devices. And this document will bring a definition which is referred to in the 2020 version. And they define multilingualism as the knowledge of a number of languages or the coexistence of different languages in a given society, right? So it can be attained simply by diversifying the languages on offer. So you write a document in different languages, like the United Nations, they have their documents in different languages. Like the CEFR documents, you can access some of the resources in different languages as well, right? Or you could be also encouraging learners to learn more than one foreign language, or maybe reducing the dominant position of English in international communication by making communication available in other languages as well. So it's the coexistence of different languages. Plurilingualism, on the other hand, has a more, say, complex concept, right? This approach emphasizes the fact that a person's experience of language in its culture, as the person's individual, as the person's experience of language in its cultural context expands. So, for example, they speak a language at home, and then they learn the language that they're going to be using in the society or in other countries or for work or study, for example. And then they develop, they expand their repertoire to speak other languages, either by learning the language at school or college or by having experiences with the language. A person who has plurilingual competencies, they don't put languages in separate areas of their brains. They are not in different compartments, but rather they make use of all those languages that they use at different levels in order to make meaning, in order to learn in different languages and to communicate in different ways. So it is not only the coexistence of different languages, but more and more how those languages in the person's brain interrelate and interact with each other so that they can convey messages and learn as well from this repertoire of several languages, right? So it's a more elaborate concept, let's say so. So this document, the 2020 version, will bring now the descriptors for plurilingual and pluricultural competencies in 3 different areas: pluricultural repertoire, plurilingual comprehension, and building on plurilingual repertoire, that is learning from the fact that you can communicate in different languages at different levels. And they even they give an example of the profile of a plurilingual proficient user. So this is an example of a profile of a plurilingual language user. They can speak different languages, and each language, they have different levels of proficiency, but they make or they allow those languages to interact so that they can communicate and learn from the fact that they can do this in different languages and communicate and make sense of knowledge and languages by making sure that the languages are interacting in their brain. So this is an idea or an example of a profile of a plurilingual language user, which you can explore. The other thing as well, before we finish, is that after the companion volume, the CEFR, the Council of Europe, has also made available a new handbook, which helps us, schools, teachers, etc., to align language education with the CEFR. And it starts with this very important point to pay attention to, which is making sure that what we do aligns curriculum, delivery, and assessment. So it's not just having the curriculum, but making sure that the curriculum is delivered well and that the assessment is somehow related to the way we deliver with the principles that we put in place. Just to give you an idea, by curriculum, they mean the formal and the informal curriculum, which learners learn that is not necessarily specified in the curriculum. That's the informal curriculum. The delivery includes the teacher selection, teacher training, accreditation, all the courses, qualifications, professional development, learning materials, the physical environment the learners are in. All of these are related to the delivery. And of course, assessment, making sure that assessment is aligned with those 3 points, right? So that includes developmental assessment, diagnostic assessment, formative assessment, aspects of progress, and of course, judgmental assessment for placement purposes when learners join the program, or aspects of progress throughout, and also assessment for achievement and proficiency levels as well. So all those 3 points need to be closely connected, and the handbook has lots of guidelines to help us in our careers, with our students, and in our institutions to align language education with the CEFR. And this is a highly recommended resource, which will be referred to in Nick Savile's talk. So I hope you have a wonderful morning with all those sessions, and we are looking forward to welcoming the upcoming speakers. So thank you, Roberta, and I think it's time for me to stop sharing.
Thank you, Alberto. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. We have one question for you here already, Alberto, and I saw that Silvana is also helping to answer a few questions here in the chat, and we have lots of interactions coming along here. Alberto, let me ask you, I guess that the mediating skills imply that you can master tenses and other aspects of grammar, even in metalinguistic terms. Is that right? Can you give us an example, please?
Yes, that is right. But also the aspects of mediation there is not necessarily related to the fact that you can name the terms in language. For example, the adjectives, the pronouns. It's all about the competencies to mediate communication in a way to yourself, making notes of concepts or how you understand concepts, and among people across languages or in your own language. So for example, my brother is a graphic designer. If I need to explain something to him about language teaching, I have to mediate this concept very carefully because he's not familiarized with the terms that teachers are. So, and when he mediates his concepts in graphic design for me, he has to use a completely different language, talking to me as if I were, 4 years old, so I can understand those concepts.
Thank you, Alberto. We have one more question from Luis Pacheco. He asks, what's the main difference between production and mediating?
Well, language production is communication, for example, speaking and writing. This production could be in interaction over the phone when you are texting or when you are writing an email, and speaking if you are talking to people or if you are doing a monologue, like doing a presentation or giving a lecture, for example. Mediating is or maybe explaining certain things about content. So that's the main difference. It's language production, but not specifically because you are speaking or writing, but because you are in other words, in inverted commas, translating certain points or concepts to other people.
One more, Alberto. My Cambridge certificate is B2 first in FC, right? What can I do to prepare myself to get a C1, for example?
Well, you can talk to one of our prep centers, and Farroupilha Open Center can help you with that. And of course, there are many resources to help you. And one of the go-to places for those resources is our website. Go to the C1 Advanced exam on our website and click on preparation. You will find a number of activities and ideas and materials for you to start preparing. But talk to one of the prep centers, and Farroupilha Open Center can help you.
We can place also the link in a moment here in the chat for you. Alberto, we had lots of interaction here. We have one more question and many different comments. I want to just highlight some of the comments here. Carmen says, I'm really glad to know that the word native speaker is out. Frankly, I dislike this. It doesn't help students. In fact, it forces them to think they need to forget their way of speaking. So thank you, Carmen. And we have another one, just a second. Silvana answered Diego. I'm not sure if she was able to put it in the chat for everyone. She said, Diego, level and repertoire have different meanings. Your linguistic repertoire is all the knowledge you have of all the languages you use. For each language you speak, you use it at a certain level of competence. Yeah. Thank you, Silvana. Yes. And we have one more question, one last question for Alberto here. Would concept in the CFR refer only to concept and terms and ideas of specific areas? Or would they also refer to concept and meanings of features of meanings that differ across languages?
Well, concept is something that you need to probably clarify. For example, one of the concepts that we work with is the concept of plurilingualism. It's not something that has a specific and single definition, but it is a concept. And because this is a concept, there are many elements that we need to consider when talking about it. You see that I showed a big chunk of text because I couldn't simply define it in one sentence. It's not something simple because there are many ideas related to the concept of plurilingualism. So this is what we call a concept. It's not just a case of the meaning of something.
Alberto, can you clarify the difference between plurilingualism and multilingualism? And this is the last one because we need to go to last to talk. Or next to talk, I'm sorry.
Multilingualism, according to the CFR, is the existence of different languages or the coexistence. They exist together as part of a document or because, for example, a school offers different languages in their curriculum. And plurilingualism has to do with how you use the different languages to talk about yourself, what you do, and your repertoire, or like Silvana said, your repertoire or your knowledge of the world in different languages at different levels. So this is how you make use of the languages to communicate and also to learn, absorb information.
Thank you so much, Alberto, for clarifying and asking also all those questions. And next, I'd like to invite Silvana Richardson, Head of Education at Bell UK, Academic Director at Bell Teacher Academy, Cambridge, England, and the Strategic Education Advisor at the Bell Foundation. She has worked in the field of English language teaching for 35 years as a teacher, academic manager, teacher, educator, inspector, and consultant. Silvana is the author of the forthcoming book on promoting learning for Cambridge University Press and Assessment. Her topic today is teaching English in a multilingual world. Silvana, welcome. Thank you so much for being here today. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm going to try and share the right screen. I've got two screens, and sometimes it makes things complicated. So you let me know if you can see. Can you see a full screen, or can you see two screens at the moment?
Full screen, Silvana.
Fantastic. So as it should be, yeah?
Okay, yes.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Good morning, good afternoon almost, yeah? It's 2 o'clock in sunny and summery Cambridge. So welcome to this talk, which is, as the title says, Teaching English in a Multilingual World. So, as you know, English is the language that people from all over the world and all around the world use to talk to each other. In other words, is the lingua franca of the world, the language of business, the language of science, the language of academia, etc., etc. And thankfully, this is why we have a job and we have a profession. But when we look at how we all over the world use language, a much more complex and fascinating landscape happens. And one of the things that we notice when people actually use languages is that they don't just use English. And even when we use English, other languages appear as well. So in a minute, I want you to explore and think about how we language meaning as a verb here, by the way, to language means to use language and the way that people use language. So in a minute, I'm going to ask you to think about how you and the people you live with and work with and interact with use language in your school, in your home, in your society at large. And in order to do that, I'm going to give you a few examples of other countries and other cities where English, like in Brazil, is not a majority language. So as I tell you and show you examples of other countries, I would like you to think of the following. And if you want to take a photo when I finish this slide so that you remember what I would like you to listen up for. So as you listen, think about how language is used where you live, for example, in oral communication, in social media. So how do people in the social media that you have actually use language? But also in public signs and spaces, for example, in schools, in hospitals, in public transport, in shops, in places of worship. And also, can I ask you to think about if the language practices or languaging practices that I'm going to be talking to you about are similar to your context. So if the things that I will be describing are similar, I would like to know, and I would like you to think about how, what happens there. And if not, how do people language differently in your context? So let me show you my first example. I'm going to show you two different examples. So my first example is a little bit far from you. It's Pamplona in Spain. And here's a photo that I took when I was in Pamplona, and it's a sign in 4 languages that explains what happens on San Fermín Day, which is a day where people run together with bulls, as you can see in the photo. But let's focus on the sign, and what we'll see instantly is that the sign is in 4 different languages: Spanish, Euskera or Basque, which are the 2 official languages of that region of Spain, but also in English and in French, of course, for tourists. And this is typical of multilingual societies that, speak more than one language, but also have a great influx of tourists. But let's go closer to home. And here is an example of my city and your neighboring country, the city of Buenos Aires in Argentina. And have a look at how language is being used in these signs that I've also taken photos of. So this sign says it's a sign in a shop, and it's placed near the lift. And what the sign is trying to do is to encourage the shoppers to use the stairs instead of the lift. So it says, burn calorías, use las escaleras, no excuse. So have a look here. We're not just using 2 separate languages here, Spanish and English. Let's have a look at how language is being used here. So we've got burn in English, then we've got calorías in Spanish, and very cleverly used here because calorías is it's a cognate, it's a word that sounds very similar. So if you don't know English, you can work it out. Calorías, calories, it's very similar. Then a phrase in Spanish. And also the other thing to say here is that burn calorías and quemar calorías, which is burn in Spanish, is the same collocation and the same words with the same meaning. And then use las escaleras, which you would expect all the Argentinian people to understand. And then the phrase in English, no excuse. So sorry. So what we see here is not just Spanish being used and all the sentence in Spanish, and then English being used and the whole sentence in English. What we're seeing here is a deliberate mixing of English and Spanish, deliberate hybridity, people being creative, playful with language for effect. The next sign on the left, it says exhausto, exhausted, take a break in English, 8 or ocho in Spanish, we don't know because it's a number, pisos, floors, down. And again, that mixture of English and Spanish being brought together. Another sign, and this is my last example, this is outside a window. It's a humorous sign at a cafe in an area where a lot of psychoanalysts and psychologists work. So it's a play on, you know, those kind of plaques that say in this place, X, somebody famous or, you know, somebody, a politician or a writer did this or that, was born, died, etc. Well, this one says Freud never ate here in English, and then y Lacan, the other psychologist, tampoco in Spanish. So here we see half a sentence, so a whole clause in English, and then the second clause in Spanish, which is fascinating, this mixture of English and Spanish. So just a reminder that we know from reality that monolingualism is not the norm. So speaking one language isn't the norm. What's the norm is multilingualism. And I can think, for example, of the south of Brazil, where of course, you speak Portuguese. I've also, when I was in Porto Alegre, I heard Portuñol being spoken. You know, on the border with Argentina and Paraguay, there's Guarani being spoken. So these are simple examples of multilingualism being the norm. And why is multilingualism the norm in the world? Well, first of all, globalization has even, you know, the world has always been multilingual from the Romans, you know, but there's a new brand, if you like, or a new type or style of multilingualism brought forward by globalization, but also transnational movement of the population, as we have seen in the last decades, but equally the rise of the World Wide Web and, you know, and basically people interacting, which means that in the past, we had, for example, cultures and societies that were closely geographically located would speak each other's languages. As I was saying, you know, Portuñol in the south of Brazil and in the north of Argentina is that kind of encounter, if you like, of Portuguese and Spanish on the boundaries. However, because of globalization and because of transnational movement of population and because of the World Wide Web, what we now see is a different type of multilingualism in addition to the other one. So what we see is that languages that are geographically distanced are now being used together. So that's quite fascinating. So, well, this is now your turn to tell me whether the languaging practices where you live, where you work, even think about the teacher's room when you are seated with your colleagues talking, are they similar to my example? So can I ask you to choose from the icons where you've got the raise hand icon, is that available, Roberta or Alberto? Is for participants?
The chat, you mean, Silvana?
No, I mean, you know that they can raise the hand and have other...
yes.
Yes, okay.
Yes.
So if you drop down that menu, you have agree as a green tick or disagree as a red tick. So it would be nice if you can show me whether you agree or disagree with, in other words, whether you think that what I have shown you is similar in your context or not. So I have a look at what you say. I'll give you a minute to say whether you agree or you disagree. If not, you can write, if it's any easier, you could write in the chat yes or no.
Yes.
That would be
Yes,
even
good.
easier.
Yeah.
Okay, I agree. Yes, 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 I agree. Yes, 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 quite similar. Okay, so you are familiar with what I'm saying. I'm pleased because I think that that is the case in many, many parts of the world. Thank you. Lots of agreement. So the second question for you now is, how do people translanguage in your context? So in a sentence, can you give me an example? So for example, I don't know, in my staff room, teachers mix English and Spanish, and Portuguese, whatever you think, or I don't know, in science, tell me in a sentence how you have seen those languages being used and that multilingualism and plurilingualism being used where you live. Thank you. I'll give you a minute to think and tell me. It depends on the region, of course, Theo. Yeah, at work, they mix English and Spanish. That's interesting. German and Portuguese being mixed in the classroom. Oh, yes, Luciana. My students mix English and Portuguese. For example, darum like. Yes, yes, guys. Podemos hacer una call. That's interesting. Yes. So you see, all this is what we would call people who work at the stock market, German, Portuguese, Spanish, Spanish and Portuguese. I mix Portuguese and English in the classroom. Yes, many teachers do. Darum like, again, yes. More in screens and social media, not in spoken, a mixture of Portuguese and English, Spanish and English in songs, Portuguese and German in the city. Sometimes fazer briefing. Yes, before, antes da meeting. That's right. Yes, thank you so much. So you have very concrete examples here to help me illustrate how people translanguage, yeah? Trans, beautiful language. We go beyond using very tidily one sentence in one language and another sentence in another language, as you were saying, darum like, where we mix languages. Thank you so much. Very, very good examples. And you've already started discussing this, but what languages do your students typically use? For example, number one, when they chat spontaneously in class, or when they work on activities with their partners with whom they have languages in common. So can you answer these questions by saying, for example, one, Portuguese, two, Portuguese and English or whatever. To tell me about the two situations using one and two again on the chat. Thank you. Yes, Portuguese and English. People don't speak English at all. That's interesting, but use expression know-how. Okay, Portuguese and English, says Dora. Two, yes. They try to talk more than native like Portuguese and English in both cases. Portuguese in the first case and Portuguese and sometimes English when they work in class. Students always think about Portuguese before speaking in English. That's right, Portuguese in both, Portuguese, English and Portuguese. Okay, thank you so much. And that is a reality that students do translanguage in class as well, and that they use the language or the languages they know to learn that the language that they don't know are now learning. Now, I think this is something that we need to think about, that for a long, long time, and more about this later, we have been taught not to use the language or the languages that the students know, or as Alberto said, their full linguistic or language repertoires when we teach a foreign language. Now, what this means is a little bit like the teacher being Sisyphus, you know, rolling the English-only big boulder up a mountain until it reaches the summit, only for it to roll down again and again and again. Students resisting using English all the time, students resenting it, and particularly at lower levels, feeling is too difficult a challenge. So here's a thought. People translanguage, as we have seen in our examples, when using a language or languages in the real world. And here for economy, I use the definition of translanguage as using different languages together, but it means so much more than that. Now, if people translanguage using a different language in the real world, and we have thought as a profession for a long time that classrooms, language classrooms, should reflect how people use language in the real world, then it would be logical to say that people should translanguage in language classrooms to reflect language use in the real world. Now, the question is, do we? And more importantly, do you think we should? So in order to try and answer these questions, I'm going to share with you latest developments in research about how people use language in the real world. There have been seismic changes in the way that researchers, especially in second language acquisition, view second language learning and particularly multilingualism. But before we look at new developments, I'm going to spend no more than 5 minutes analyzing what came before. And what came before was a phenomenon that pervaded most areas of applied linguistics and language teaching during much of the 20th century. Now, why am I looking at this? Because the new developments in multilingualism, sometimes known as the multilingual turn, are as much about trying to describe how multilingual and bilingual people use and learn languages as it is a reaction to the monolingual bias. So let's have a look. And I'm going to be talking about the impact of this monolingual bias, first of all, in second language acquisition, research, then in English language teaching and learning, and then on the English language learner himself or herself. So remember this, all this that I'm going to be describing happened in much of the 20th century, and I would say in some parts of the world it's still true. So let's get started with second language acquisition. Now, let's look at the assumptions of underpinning, if you like, the monolingual bias. So the first assumption is that most people in the world speak only one language. And the second assumption is that native speakers are the best language users. If you put these two assumptions together, what we can conclude, says Lourdes Ortega, is that monolingual native speakers are the golden standard against which to evaluate language learning success. And this has been the case for many, many years, decades, I would say, during the 20th century. Now, let's interrogate and examine these assumptions one by one. And when we interrogate them, we see there are lots of problems. The first problem is that, as I said before, this is simply not true. Most people in the world are bilingual or plurilingual, not monolingual. The second assumption, the second problem, if you like, is that if you believe that most people in the world speak only one language, it then positions being bilingual or multilingualism as a less natural form of knowing and learning a language or languages. But more importantly, it casts a deficit light, says Lourdes Ortega, on people who learn languages later in life. And who are these? Well, these are all our students. And more importantly, most English language teachers in the world. We know, and this is quite a conservative figure, that over 80% of language teachers in the world are not monolingual native speakers of English. So by saying that multilingual speakers are not the majority and that the world only speaks one language, we're casting a deficit light on ourselves and our students. The second area, if you like, is that we're going to examine is English language teaching and learning. Now, the monolingual bias for a long, long time held this idea that language learning was a process of trying to get ever closer to the native speaker. So the ultimate aim for the English language learner was to speak English like a native speaker. Now, of course, this aim is usually unreachable. And what I mean is there are just a few people who were not born speaking English that can, after studying English for some years, sound like a native speaker. So it's a very unreachable aim for a lot of people because a lot of people don't get there. And what this creates, if you are basically asked to go somewhere where you can't reach, is the sense of failure, but also a lack of self-confidence. Another problem is that the monolingual bias for a long, long time kind of puts across this idea that the student's own language was an obstacle to learning a foreign language. So we talked in language teaching, we talked about negative transfer of interference, for example. So again, there's a deficit view of the learner's language or languages that they speak. And because of this belief that, for example, Portuguese was an obstacle for students to learn English, then there was a clear attempt to separate out the learner's own language from the target language. So what we see is 100 years of isolation of languages. And what this means in terms of methodologies is that we see for over 100 years English-only classrooms where students are banned from using their own language. So this is what we see. I'm not going to read this, but 100 years or more of methods that propose that teachers should only speak English and that students should only speak English, even the first day when they can't speak a word of English. So Guy Cook says that the impact of this language separation between the language that the students know and speak and use, in other words, their language repertoire, and the language that they're learning, is that in some circumstances, teaching which excludes the use of the student's own language from the classroom may be methodologically less effective than translation. In other words, shutting down Portuguese when students are learning English is not as effective as actually using Portuguese to learn English, and some students, more importantly, deeply resent it. Let's move on. So let's now look at the English language learner, in particular the impact of the monolingual bias on the English language learner. So what we see again is a deficit view of native speakers of other languages. So you, me as students, and the thinking that students think of beginners or students who are working at A2 are sometimes thought of and constructed as defective communicators with an underdeveloped communicative competence which betrays itself, says Lourdes Ortega, in traces of other languages. And have a look. Alberto was talking about the Common European Framework in 2001. So if we look at one descriptor from 2001, let's look at what it says. This is a descriptor of phonological control at A2, and it says, pronunciation is generally clear enough to understand despite a noticeable foreign accent, as if this were something bad that needs to be eradicated. Is this a can-do statement or a can't do or a can't do yet statement? And this is exactly what Claire Cramsch says, that traditional methodologies for this 100 years based on the native speaker usually define language learners not in terms of what they can do, even if we have said for a long time these are can-do statements, but rather in terms of what they are not, or at least not yet. So thankfully, the tide is changing, and ever since the 1990s, at least in academia, monolingualism and the monolingual bias has been critiqued and found wanting. So let's have a quick look at what the critiques are. So Lourdes Ortega, again, says that this monolingual bias, this assumption that most people in the world speak one language and that native speakers are the best language users, is not based on natural facts, it's not based on reality, but it's ideological, it's based on colonial ideology, really. And as such is unsustainable. So resulting from those criticisms also emerged in the 2000s, and particularly I would say that the really interesting books emerged 5 years ago, 7 years ago, and the multilingual turn emerged. So let's explore, this is the interesting part, I would say, of this talk, the multilingual turn in language education. So what are the key ideas? And I'm going to be giving you concrete examples and the impact of the multilingual turn as well. So here are some key ideas. First of all, that teachers, publishers, assessment bodies, etc., we should all take into account all the languages that a learner knows. In other words, their linguistic repertoire. The second important idea is that we should concentrate on what multilingual or bilingual learners can do with languages rather than focus on how language learners differ from native speakers. And the third point is that we should be using translanguaging in the classroom. I'm going to explore these ideas with examples so that we can all understand. So, why use all the languages that the students know? Well, because all the languages, i.e. my linguistic repertoire, can help me understand and learn even better. Let me give you an example. My first language is Spanish. I come from Argentina. The first foreign language I learned as a child was English. And the second language that I've learned is Italian, and I've learned it as an adult. So let me show you one word in Italian, marito, which means husband. Now, if I wanted to kind of work out using all the languages that I know, Spanish would be really, really very helpful. Look, in Spanish, marido, Italian, marito. I can work out the meaning very easily just by thinking of Spanish. In this case, the first foreign language that I've learned is not very useful. Absolutely not. But look at this other word, bagagli in Italian. Well, here is not my first language, Spanish, which is equipaje, that's helping me at all, but it's my knowledge of English that informs my understanding of the word bagagli. So this is why we shouldn't just focus on, if your students know, say they can speak, of course, Portuguese, but they can also speak, say, German, and they're now learning English, or they, also use that as well. And this is an example of why. So let's have a look at what we mean by translanguaging. And can I just say there are so many different definitions of translanguaging and conceptualizations of translanguaging above and beyond pedagogy. But because we are all language teachers here, I just wanted to focus on the pedagogical definition of translanguaging. And I'm using here Senoth and Gorter's definition. And they define translanguaging as a pedagogical strategy that includes intentional use, planned, deliberate use of different languages. So it's not just reacting. There's nothing wrong with reacting and spontaneity, but in this particular case, it's about thinking and planning how to use different languages so that we help the students to learn, say, English by using those languages. Another definition is the combination of two or more languages in a systematic, not erratic way within the same learning activity. So let me give you an example. This is an example that Senoth and Gorter propose. And because they come, again, from the Basque Country, they give us three languages: English, Spanish, and Euskera or Basque. So this is an example of an activity which is a text in English, and they have chosen cognates. In other words, words that are very similar in the three languages. So the students should be able to use a language repertoire to work out what they mean, but also what the similarities and differences are. So have a look. Number one, write the Spanish and Basque equivalents for the highlighted words. And these are not words that the students have seen before, but just by looking at ocean, if you speak Spanish, you can work out what it means. Similarly, if you come from Basque, you would also work out what it means. So all the words in pink there are words that the students could work out just by knowing Spanish and Basque, and think how much you can do, work you can do in your classrooms by doing this, by bringing in the similarities between Spanish and Portuguese. And then they look in the second part, highlight the differences, because it's not just that they're similar, but they're different. So highlight the differences in spelling. So for example, océano in Spanish, or Z in Basque, etc., and affixes. Okay, so this is an example of how you can exploit the similarities between languages and to help the students also highlight the differences once you have used their language repertoire to learn. So let's explore in a little bit more depth some of the key ideas of the multilingual turn. So it is a bit of a revolution, really. I was talking about a seismic change. So because now we have new and different views of the learners, of the goal of language learning, of the learner's own language, and of the boundaries between languages. So let's explore these very briefly. So Cook says, bilingual learners and plurilingual learners are different to monolingual users of languages. So there's very little point in comparing, he says. So these are his words. Knowing more than one language makes the person different from a monolingual, somebody who speaks only one language, in many ways. So for example, it modifies some of their cognitive processes. So we should not be compared to monolingual speakers. The way we learn is not exactly the same. So the second big change is about how we view the goal of language learners. So for many, many of our students, language learning is no longer about trying to get closer to the native speaker or to speak like a native speaker. What we see now is that the goal of language learning is to become bilingual or plurilingual. In other words, to use all the languages we know proficiently, where proficiently can mean many different things for different people. It doesn't have to be C2. So for example, I decided that I wanted to learn English to at least C2 because it was going to be my work as a teacher of English. And then when I moved to the UK to live and I got married, and I got married to an Englishman, for me, it's really, really important that I speak English really well because it allows me to do my work, to belong to this society, to have friends and relationships, etc. However, my third language, Italian, I only ever use it to go to Italy on holiday. So I'm more than happy. And for me, proficiency is being able to order a meal in a restaurant and to be understood when I'm, out and about doing things like shopping, etc. We also see that there's a change in how we view the student's own language. So it's no longer seen as an obstacle or an interference, but it's actually seen as the most valuable resource that learners have to learn the new language that they're learning. So this in turn creates a change from a deficit view of the learner's own language to an asset view. The idea is we use the languages that the students already know, their linguistic repertoire, because it is valuable and it is useful. And now another interesting change of view is that rather than seeing languages as isolated, as Alberto was saying, they're not separate systems in the brain or in the mind. What we actually see is that the boundaries between languages are beginning to blur, and that there is mutual interaction between the student's own language and other languages that they know and the language that they're learning. So what there is a softening of boundaries between languages, and that's why we see this burn calorías, use las escaleras, no excuse, etc. That kind of playful hybridity, and mix between those languages. So, and this is the bit of the talk that it's actually about us and what it means for us as language teachers supporting our learners' learning. So let's have a look at the impacts of the multilingual turn. Well, interestingly, it is the multilingual turn that created the changes that Alberto was talking about with regards to the Common European Framework. So as Alberto mentioned, there are no more comparisons made with native speakers, and high time for that to happen. And also the companion volume, as also Alberto explained, introduced new descriptors for many things, but just I want to focus on two particular very interesting things which relate more to the multilingual turn. Number one, new descriptors for plurilingual and pluricultural competence, and number two, for mediation. Let's have a look, and I'm going to not speak, I'm going to let you read in a minute what these plurilingual or pluricultural competence descriptors can look like. The important thing here is this idea that it is possible to code switch, to change back and forth during the message and to resort to bilingual forms of speech. And let me give you an example. My husband, who's English and who is, I would say he's A2 learner of Spanish, he does things like, for example, he says, obviously mente, because mente is the li in Spanish, and he blends and does creative and crazy things. And this is an example of resorting to bilingual forms of speech. But here, let's have a look at what these descriptors say. And I'm going to be silent for a minute and let you read in silence. Okay, so let me give you an example of the third one. Use one's knowledge of a number of languages or dialects to understand a text. And here I'm going to use a spoken text, and it's an Italian series that I love, which is called Montalbano. Interestingly, because I watch it with my husband, who's English, we listen to it in Italian, but we put subtitles in English. So forget about my mother tongue here. So I am using my knowledge of Italian and my knowledge of English to understand those dialogues. So that's an example of how I'm deploying my plurilingual competence to try and understand the text. Let's now look very briefly at the changes to the Common European Framework with reference to mediation. And here I'm kind of reinforcing what Alberto said before, that the traditional model of the 4 skills, if you like, of listening, speaking, reading, and writing, has been considered inadequate to capture the complex reality of communication. Because if you think about it, when do you ever only just listen? I can, for example, I sometimes listen to YouTube, to the radio on YouTube, and even though, or, you know, through my app, my BBC app, for example, and even when I'm just listening, I'm also speaking. Mentally, I'm replying to the people speaking, or even out loud. When do you just read? When I read a book, for example, I always read pencil in hand, or if I read with my Kindle, finger ready, and I'm very actively reading. So I'm making comments on the margins. I'm reacting and responding. So reading is a very productive activity as well. Think of how you use WhatsApp. You don't just read, you read and write. And sometimes you write using multimedia, like you insert a GIF or an emoticon or a video. But more importantly, sometimes somebody writes to you, so you have to read, but you'll decide, because you don't want to type up, you want to speak instead. So you use your microphone and send a spoken message. So the reality of language use is much more complex than just separating out those 4 skills. And this is why the changes to the Common European Framework are focusing on 4 modes of communication: reception, that would be listening or reading; production, that would be like what I'm doing now. I'm just talking, kind of monologue-like, but that could be written production as well. Interaction, so when I talk to you and you talk to me, so there's speaking and listening at the same time, or if you think of WhatsApp, is reading and writing at the same time. But more importantly, that addition and expansion of mediation. Because these modes of communication are much closer to real life language use. So Alberto touched upon this, but a definition of mediation here is to act as an intermediary as a bridge between people who cannot understand each other directly. In other words, is to help or support people who do not understand each other to be able to communicate. Now, this happens normally, but not exclusively, between speakers of different languages. So here I'm just focusing on cross-linguistic mediation because we're looking at multilingualism. But as Alberto explained, you can mediate in the same language. So why are we now focusing on mediation? And the Common European Framework's response is because mediation language activities occupy a really important place in the normal linguistic functioning of our societies. Think, for example, of a refugee who goes to hospital and because they have a problem, a health problem, if there isn't somebody there translating or interpreting, it's impossible for them to seek the health service that they need. This is why it's so important to be able to mediate. So let's have a couple of cross-linguistic examples of cross-linguistic mediation. And again, I'm going to let you read. I'm going to be silent. And my question here for you is, when you trained to be a teacher, were you taught to translate or to interpret it, or to interpret? I wasn't. My whole language education as a language teacher was in English only. So my problem now is that when I have to interpret between my husband and my family or friends who don't speak English, is that I'm rubbish at interpreting. I have no idea how to do it, which is a shame. Here are some examples of oral interpretation. But also written mediation. Have a look. And these are all very useful and necessary mediation examples. So let me show you an example of how a colleague of mine at work has used mediation, linguistic mediation, cross-linguistic mediation, to help her learners become good at mediating between languages. So she used this example, but and this is what she said to her learners: use your phone to find a news article about a local, unusual, or extreme weather event. She gave an example of one here. The article must be in your own language. And here, if this is not of interest to your learners, you could absolutely change this for a news article about your favorite singer or your favorite band or your favorite TikToker or Instagrammer or influencer or football player, whatever really makes your learners tick. The important thing is that they find a local article and it must be in their own language. Stage 2. Read and note the main points from the article. So what are the most important points in the article? Then translate those key points into English. So we give the students time to think about those points and to translate them into English. And it is perfectly possible that they may not know all the words that they need. And this is where the learning happens. And this is where they also pick up the skills to be able to independently find new words in English by using online dictionaries, also by asking each other, but also asking you. Stage 4, prepare to tell your partner, where they're going to work in pairs next, about your chosen article in English. So now they're thinking about how they're going to summarize the article in English, in speech. You can use an online bilingual dictionary and pictures if you wish. And then 5, tell your partner about your article. And then 6, for the partner, listen to your partner's story and take notes. So it's a very, very simple activity that does what Alberto was, when he was reading the descriptors, he was saying, relay the content of a text in language A into language B. So this is an idea of what happens in that kind of activity. There's a stage where we give the students, or the students actually seek input by reading or listening to a text, either oral or written, in language A. Then they spend some time processing that text, so doing thinking or planning tasks. And here you can decide whether it's in language A or language B. And then the output stage, the students speak and listen to each other in language B. Now, there are so many different variations. This is just an example of what can happen, but you can have the input in language B, and then the students have got to produce the output in language A, etc. So this is, this is how in that task, we can see that translanguaging cycle. So the reading and the noting down the main points would be the input stage, the translation of the key points into English, and the preparation to tell their partner about the article would be the processing stage. And the telling the partner about the article would be the output stage. Now, let's have a look at what the students say, because I think it's really interesting. And again, I'll let you read what the students said about this activity. And as you can see, this is student language. Have a look at the last sentence. It made me memorized, meaning it made me remember the vocabulary. But I find fascinating that by doing this kind of activity, they notice that it's much easier to translate, in your case, from English to Portuguese, for example, than it is to go from Portuguese to English, and how that activity challenged them to find the right words and to look up those right words, and how that helped them learn vocabulary, not just the act of just, you as a teacher teaching them the meaning of something, but in this case, they had to look it up. They had to check that it was right. They had to write it down because they had to write down the main points and they had to prepare, and then they had to use it in speech. So they had multiple opportunities to actually use that word, which means that that's why that last learner is saying, I'd like to do this kind of activity again because it made me memorize the words. So a very challenging and a very generative activity. So given that, as we said, or rather the Common European Framework said that mediation language activities occupy an important place in the normal linguistic functioning of our societies, my question to you is whether you frequently come across mediating activities in the teaching materials that you use, in the course book, in the supplementary materials. How often do you see mediating activities, the way that I showed you, cross-linguistic activities? And the second question is, how often do you give your students opportunities to practice mediating activities? I don't want you to respond to that question. I just want you to think about that for a second. As I said to you before, I learned English and Italian with a methodology that did not allow me to use my mother tongue and that did not encourage me to translanguage. And as a result, I'm really not good at that. And it's a shame because there are so many contexts where I should and could translanguage, and sometimes I find it difficult. I don't know what you think about that and what your experience is. So what does it all mean in practice? For you, for me, for all of us? Well, I would say let's wake up to multilingualism and mediation, because the changes to the Common European Framework will mean, if then I would say in some countries they're already well underway, changes to syllabuses. So for example, the inclusion of mediation, changes to course book and materials. So for example, Cambridge University Press and Assessment has published some activities in some books already where you do have adaptations for mediation. Tests and exams, more about this later. What your students need to learn, because now and in the future, the students will need to learn to mediate and to use their plurilingual competencies as part of the learning of a foreign language. But because of that, because students will need to learn how to mediate and will need to learn how to use and deploy their plurilingual competence, then what that means is that us teachers will need to learn about mediation to be able to teach it, for example, and we'll need to learn to interpret and to translate to be able to teach our students. And therefore, of course, there will be changes to the way you teach, your teaching practice. So, of course, this has an impact on assessment. And Zenoth and Gorter say that tests should always match the actual language practices and multilingual use resources from the whole linguistic repertoire. So if teaching is going in the direction of a multilingual focus and of using all the languages that the students know, then they say assessment should also follow the same path. And let me show you a couple of examples where this is already happening. This is an example of Cambridge English qualifications, pre-A1 starters, A1 movers, and A2 flyers, the handbook for teachers. This is an example for 2018, and I'd like to thank Dr. Nick Saville for this example. And this is an example of plurilingual ability at A2, and these are the descriptors. Can use a word from another language in the student's look at that plurilingual repertoire to make him or herself understood in a routine everyday situation where he or she cannot think of an adequate expression in the language being spoken. Now, have a look at that text written by a student at the bottom left-hand corner of the page. One day, Sam and Mary played basketball. They are very happy. Suddenly, basketball in the ocean. One high tune. Help, they catch the basketball. And now look at that word there, which presumably means dolphin. And we know because of the context that it does mean dolphin. Now, this student has been able to use a word from their own language to make him or herself understood when he or she cannot use an adequate expression in the language that they're speaking. So this is an example of plurilingual ability. In the past, this would have been marked down as an example of the student not knowing the word dolphin. Now it's seen as an example of plurilingual ability. And have a look at the score there, bottom right-hand corner. There you go, full marks. Okay, this is another example of mediation in assessment. This is an example from Spain. Escuelas Oficiales de Idiomas are language schools which are financed by the Spanish state. And this is an exam. This is intermediate, so it's B2 level, and it tests oral mediation. Now let's have a look at what it's asking the students to do. You have read this article. I'm going to show you the article in a minute, which compares how we used to travel to the way we travel nowadays. Summarize its main ideas for your Canadian friend. So the task again is to read the article and then summarize it in speech for someone who's a speaker of English. Now let's look at the article. The article is in Spanish. So there's a double mediation exercise here from, sorry, I'm really sorry. I don't know why my phone is ringing. Thank you. I thought I had it in off. Okay, so apologies for that. So as I said, two types of mediation here, from Spanish into English, but also relaying a written text in speech. So I would say the multilingual turn in a nutshell is a phrase, it's like a phrase used by Joseph Lobianco, who said that there are two disadvantages in global language arrangements. One of them is not knowing English, and the other one, and this is the multilingual turn, is knowing only English. Or as a meme in social media, why do you have an accent? My answer would be, I don't know. Why do you only speak one language? Thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Silvana. It has been wonderful. You have no idea how much interaction we had on the chat, and thank you everyone for participating and interacting with us, with Silvana. It has been amazing. So we do have a few questions for you, Silvana. The first one is about your book. Do you have a title for it yet? People were asking.
Do I have a title? Yes. Yeah. It's Promoting Professional Learning, and it's coming out next year, 2023.
Okay, thank you. Fabiana asked this. So Promoting Professional Learning, right? Thank you. Another question. How can we as teachers deal with the change of the 4 skills that still keep going in private courses since this changing of focus is taking place?
This is a fantastic question, and it's not difficult to do actually, because you can still work with a book that works with the 4 skills. But what you would have in that book, for example, let's take a book that you use, and let's take that example that I gave you about the article. Yeah. So in a book, an article would naturally be in English. And you read it in English, and the questions are in English, and everything is in English. What you can do, for example, is to get the students to find an article on the same topic, but from the Brazilian press or a similar story in Portuguese, and prepare, say, for homework, again, to use the key points. And then, in class, it's about discussing the similarities and the differences in point of view or opinion between the article in the book and the article that they had to look up. So that would be one example. Another typical example for older learners, where you've got examples of restaurants and menus, you know, and learning about a menu in English and ordering food in English. Now, you can create the situation whereby you've got a colleague from work or a friend or a family member who lives in a, you know, who's English or American or, you know, or even German. It doesn't matter. They don't have to be native speakers, but the only language that you have in common with that friend or that colleague is English. So you take, you know, they come to visit you. So this is interesting because the menu may not be in English, but even if the menu is in English, in a Brazilian restaurant, there are some concepts that you have to explain. Feijoada, would they know what it is? No. So you would have to explain it in English. So it's about thinking of a context where you bring in the need to express that kind of lack of understanding, that, you know, when somebody doesn't know something either about the language or about the culture, and you have to explain it. So it's just finding that angle, and it doesn't, you know, it's just also getting into the habit. We had to learn here as well in the school where I work, because when we started, you know, with mediation, there weren't published materials. So we started improvising and creating. And now we have found some books that use mediation in some activities. So use your creativity. Just think about a situation where somebody, you know, you put two people who would not understand each other, and there needs to be some form of mediation there. Yeah.
Great, Silvana, thank you. One last question. Do you consider that translanguaging is really different from international code switching, or is it just an issue in the academia? That's
a very interesting question as well. So code switching means switching from one language to another, yeah? As I've shown you. Translanguaging, as I said, there's much more to translanguaging than code switching, because it's about, for example, identity is about who you are as well. When you know, I'm a plurilingual speaker. It's about many more things. It's a philosophy. Like, so I'm not gonna. I think if you're interested, I can recommend a fantastic book that explores that, which is called Translanguaging by Ofelia Garcia and Li Wei, and they look at all those fantastic aspects. But I think for us, because we are language teachers, I'm interested in exploring the pedagogical aspect of translanguaging.
Okay, Silvana, thank you so much. It has been wonderful. People were commenting here a lot, and they are so pleased that you came to speak to us, to talk to us today. Thank you so much.
You're
now,
very
everyone,
welcome.
Thank you. Now it's time for a break. So we'll have a 15-minute break. It's 11:07, just turned 11:07. So we'll be back at 11:20. Is that okay? 11:22, okay, to be sharp. So we'll be waiting for you. Grab your coffee, grab your cup of tea, and be back because you can't miss the final one, okay? See you soon.
Grow, grew, grown. When you grow up, what will you be when you grow up? She grows, she learns, she improves. Her interest is growing. She grows in she will prove herself. She grows in curiosity. She is curious. Curiosity. Her passion is growing stronger. She grows in confidence. She grows in confidence. I will grow in confidence, prove myself, and reach my full potential. This is where ambition grows, where potential grows. and where your future goes. Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to learn about the sky at night. Cambridge is where your world grows.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. And we would like to invite the marketing director of Cambridge University Press and Assessment, Leonardo Esperança, who's going to talk to us a little bit about our brand and our brand value proposition. Come, Leo. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. Can you guys hear me? Is it okay? Can you see me? Can you hear me? Okay,
Very
good.
well.
Yes.
Thank you. I'll introduce myself in English, but my presentation was made in Portuguese. So apologies, Nick.
That's okay.
You can practice your listening in Portuguese. So first of all, I'd like to thank for the invitation and congratulate Luciane Calcara for setting this meeting. Cambridge Experience for the 4th edition. Is that right? Yeah, the 4th edition. And it's an amazing initiative, Luciane, and congratulations, and thanks for inviting me to share with you a little bit of some news that we have that we would like to share with you and your colleagues all over Brazil, and with good names, Nick Saville, Silvana Richardson, Alberto. So it's a very well-organized event, very good and important names in the ELT world. And I would like to actually share my screen. Let me just quickly. Please let me know if you can see my screen.
Tudo certo, Léo. Falta só pôr o modo apresentação.
Okay. Good.
Perfeito.
Yes.
Now, switching to Portuguese. Vou falar um pouquinho de algumas novidades que eu gostaria de compartilhar com vocês nesse evento importante, nesse sábado. Obrigado a todos que estão presentes, obrigado pelo convite, Luciane, obrigado pela organização aí também, Roberto e Alberto. E vou começar falando sobre essa grande novidade que estamos vivendo nós da Cambridge. Então, há um ano atrás, Cambridge University Press e Cambridge Assessment English iniciaram um processo de fusão, né? Apesar de ambas os departamentos da universidade fazerem parte da Universidade de Cambridge, as operações atuavam diferentes em diversos países, em todos os países. E iniciou-se um processo de fusão desses departamentos. Tá? E, felizmente, neste momento, Cambridge University Press e Cambridge Assessment English se tornam uma única organização. Tá? Então, a primeira mudança que vocês vão perceber daqui em diante é a marca Cambridge, né? Que a gente vai começar a atuar no mercado só com o brasão Cambridge e o escrito mesmo, né? A parte escrita Cambridge. Tá? Que significa que ambas as organizações estão atuando juntos. Tá bom? E o que isso significa para vocês, né? Então, a gente está combinando, né, as publicações da Cambridge University Press mais as avaliações de Cambridge Assessment English para gerar um maior impacto educacional. O que isso significa no fim da linha? Melhor apoio ao ensino, mais confiança na aprendizagem, mais segurança na avaliação e maior inovação em nossas pesquisas. Nós aprendemos muito com esses insights que vocês nos dão, e isso é base para as nossas pesquisas, tanto para a publicação de materiais quanto para a produção de exames. Welcome to Cambridge. Bem-vindos a Cambridge. Acreditamos que a língua está no cerne do ser humano, e o inglês pode criar uma vida inteira de experiências. Nós ajudamos as pessoas a se conectarem, se comunicarem e se aproximarem. Esse é o nosso papel aqui. Junto com professores e os nossos parceiros, como o Colégio Farroupilha, nós estamos aqui para engajar e inspirar milhões de pessoas ao longo de toda a sua jornada de aprendizado. Então, a Cambridge, né, com as publicações e com os exames, ela contempla aí toda a jornada de aprendizado, ajudando as pessoas a aprenderem inglês e a provar as suas habilidades para o mundo. Where Your World Grows. Cambridge é Where Your World Grows. Essa é a nossa nova promessa de marca, tá? Então, a Cambridge, junto com Cambridge Assessment English, Cambridge University Press, oferece soluções diversas de ensino e aprendizagem e avaliações. Aqui o nosso diferencial, rapidamente, né? O nosso DNA. Então, como parte da Universidade de Cambridge, tudo que é feito por nós é baseado em pesquisa, tá? Então, desde a gente, né, quando vai produzir um material novo, exames, a gente traz aqui os editores, os autores, para entender o mercado, fazer pesquisa, e isso é insumo para a produção de tudo que a gente tem, tá? Uma jornada como nenhuma outra. Então, a Cambridge, né, tem essa jornada agora com publicações e com exames. Então, isso oferecido de forma única. Então, a gente contempla toda a jornada de aprendizado, incluindo também a validação pelos exames. O nosso suporte, a nossa colaboração e parceria. Então, o suporte, a gente tem equipe local, tá? Em todos os estados, em Porto Alegre, nas principais capitais, São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Florianópolis, Norte e Nordeste, temos representação. Então, vocês podem contar com o suporte da Cambridge. Colaboração, colaboramos com projetos também das instituições, né? Projetos novos, ideias, estamos abertos a isso. E parcerias, assim como temos com o Colégio Farroupilha. E o último, e não tão importante, mas o macro, é ser parte da Universidade de Cambridge. Então, isso nos deixa muito preparados e com esse diferencial competitivo perante os concorrentes. E a gente quer trabalhar junto com vocês para ajudar a expandir o mundo de todos, né? Não só dos alunos, dos professores, mas da educação como um todo. E o padrão Cambridge. Então, as expectativas estabelecidas pela Universidade de Cambridge não param nas universidades. Está em tudo que a gente faz. Então, esses padrões, eles garantem que você e seus alunos recebam os produtos e serviços que esperam. São reconhecidos em todo o mundo, entregues por uma equipe na qual você pode confiar. A Cambridge é uma organização sem fins lucrativos. Então, todo o nosso lucro ele é reinvestido na educação, que permite ampliar o impacto da universidade na sociedade. Queremos colaborar, crescer juntos com vocês. Então, acreditamos que os melhores relacionamentos são construídos com base na confiança, na colaboração e apoio mútuo. E é isso que você pode esperar de nós. Então, assim como o Colégio Farroupilha, vocês aí espalhados por todo o Brasil podem esperar isso da gente. Tá? Uma colaboração, um apoio e um relacionamento bem próximo. A gente também se preocupa, né, assim como o Colégio Farroupilha, vocês, com o futuro da educação. Não só o que acontece na sala de aula, mas também o que acontece além dela. Tá? E nossa rede de suporte se estende a uma comunidade de pessoas e parceiros que se dedicam para a melhoria do ensino da língua inglesa no Brasil. Essa é a mensagem que eu gostaria de passar para vocês. Tem muito mais coisas acontecendo, né? E vocês podem nos seguir nas redes sociais, @CambridgeBrasil. Estamos no Insta, no Facebook, no YouTube, no LinkedIn. E eu fico à disposição também, tem meu contato aqui, leonardo.esperanca@cambridge.org. Tá? Obrigado, gente. Um bom evento para todos. Obrigado, Rô.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Leo. Thank you for telling us and explaining us a little bit more about our merge and the brand value proposition and everything. Thank you so much. So now I'd like to invite Nick Saville, Director of Thought Leadership for Cambridge English and the elected Secretary General of the Association of Language Testers in Europe, AUTI. Nick is a consultant for European institutions, including the Council of Europe, the European Parliament, and the EU Commission. In this capacity, he has been involved in the development of the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, the CFR, since its inception, and more recently was an invited expert for the development and validation of the companion volume. He has worked on educational reforms which use the CFR as a basis in developing curricula and setting objectives for learning. Today, he will talk about systemic alignment in the Brazilian context, the Cambridge approach to LOA. Welcome, Nick. Thank you so much for being here with us. And the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Roberta. Let me just share my screen, and then I'll get on with the talk. Let's see if that comes up.
Yes, almost there.
Is it there? Yes.
Yes,
so I need to press this button here.
Yes. Yes, Nick, we can see it.
Okay, so I just need to move my picture out of the way of my slides. So, bom dia, and hello and greetings from Cambridge. As you see, this is my talk. And I have to say, first off, thanks to the organizers for inviting me to speak today. And it's great to be back in Brazil, even not in person this time. And yes, if you look carefully, that's me in the middle of this picture 12 years ago. Spot the difference. That's right, no tie back then. I have been back since, but not for a while. So I'm looking forward to coming again soon in person. Go ahead, my slides, please. There we are. Well, I'm particularly pleased to share with you today the Cambridge approach to LOA, that's learning-oriented assessment in the Brazilian context. And I'll be talking about how we can align macro educational policies to the micro level context in your schools and colleges. And this is what is called systemic alignment, as I'll illustrate, I hope. Today, I'd like you, please, to reflect on your own learning contexts and the languages you speak and use in classrooms, and to think about the alignment of our large-scale exams, like the Cambridge English qualifications, to your own teaching and learning practices. So how can we do this better to improve outcomes? And of course, I will make a reference or two to plurilingualism in this case. The fantastic work that goes on at the Colégio Farroupilha, I think, provides a fascinating case study at the micro level and can be referred to as an excellent example of this working in practice. And by the way, as you see here, I noticed their impressive mission statement. And it occurred to me, as you've just heard from Leo, that this actually is quite similar to our own mission statement in Cambridge. That is, to contribute to society in a broad sense through education and research internationally, I would say, at the highest levels of excellence. So I think we share some common goals here. Before I go on, I just wanted to apologize if you've heard me speak about this before. I have been talking about it for a while. And as you see on the screen here, I've got my own little logo for learning-oriented assessment, which I often use, with the learning and assessment going hand in hand to promote better learning. But I haven't just repeated the same old thing over and over again. If you're particularly interested in this topic, I'd like to recommend this recent publication on LOA for languages, edited by Gabriel. I have a chapter in it on the concept of systemic LOA that I'll be covering today. There's also another by colleagues in Cambridge focusing on teacher perspectives. So as you will see, I hope, I've added some new parts that are included in the talk today. Okay, so systemic, alignment, and LOA. From a Cambridge perspective, this is the challenge shown here on the screen: to link large-scale external exams and assessments into a systemic or coherent relationship with other types of assessment that occur in learning contexts, both inside and outside of classrooms. And I would add, so that they all can support better language learning. And that includes all types and functions of assessment that you'll be familiar with, including, for example, self and peer assessment, not just tests. Here are some key words and concepts from my chapter and other presentations, which will crop up again today: ecosystem theories, alignment, integrated learning and assessment, or ILA, and positive impact by design. And these are central to our Cambridge approach. And so I'm sure you'll be hearing more about these ideas from local Cambridge teams in the future. Just a point about positive impact. In systemic LOA, we seek to address the tensions that occur sometimes between the macro level educational policy making and assessments and the micro level implementation in classrooms. These tensions can often lead to divergence between the goals of large-scale assessment and the desirable classroom practices. And when there is this kind of poor alignment between learning goals and assessment, something which we call negative washback or negative impact occurs. And this is something to be avoided by seeking, as a design principle, positive impact. So trying to avoid that negative effect when the two things are separate. I take as a starting point for alignment the need for a common framework of reference, such as the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, which encompass learning, teaching, and assessment. As you know, this is called the CFR. It's the best known example of its kind. And I think most of you are familiar with it or have heard about it and its main features, as it's already celebrating 20 years last year since its launch in 2001. And I've highlighted the R for reference because it's very much a reference document to be used in your own context in ways which are appropriate. There's a link to the original publication there if you haven't had a chance to read it. It's free, it's freely available. The CFR provides a reference tool to support systemic alignment. As it says here, it's a common basis for the elaboration of language syllabuses, curriculum guidelines, examinations, textbooks, and so on. And 4 of its key central principles are listed here. It provides a level system and scales, 6-level framework as the basis. It's an action-oriented approach which incorporates a communicative approach to language teaching and learning. It deals with this in descriptive terms which are called can-do statements. And it's actually a plurilingual endeavor because it's been designed for all languages. So it promotes plurilingualism and lifelong language learning. And I'll come back to that at the end to highlight some new additions, some of which I think may have been covered by Silvana. And just looking at this diagram, it's a bit like a pie with different slices. The diagram shows the components, the typical components of the educational system that need to be better aligned so that they deliver the policy goals, the educational goals, which are desirable. In this respect, the CFR provides a tool for harmonization of stakeholder views and behaviors and the alignment of these 4 segments of educational provision in a local context. So you can see here around the outside. The CFR has been successfully adapted, in fact, to meet contextual needs and sometimes preferences of local education policymakers. And that was originally intended. It was designed specifically to be adapted if necessary. And it has been in many contexts, both in Europe and beyond, including Asia and Latin America. I think it's already being used successfully in many ways in the Brazilian context, and it's providing tangible benefits, as in the case of the Colégio Farroupilha, for example. Now, before I go on, I'd like just for you to reflect a minute on this diagram, which is thinking about the components of an educational system. So reading from the top down to the bottom, with the goal is to provide our learners with their plurilingual repertoire, in our case, including English. The aim is to achieve alignment, for example, between the curriculum, the pedagogy, and assessment. And this needs to be at both the macro or policy level and at the micro level in schools and classrooms. This is achieved by having a common purpose and shared understandings amongst participants, some of whom are shown in the box at the top right. So the ones who actually make the policy, those who deliver it, and those who have views about it, like the members of the public, parents, the press, and so forth. Examination providers like Cambridge need to work closely with schools and teachers, and they play a key role in implementing this systemic model. This is, if you like, the Cambridge approach, what we desire to do. And in so doing, we want to make sure that our assessments do not have negative impacts, but on the contrary, build in by design the impacts, the positive impacts that we intend. So let's start with the common framework and think about your context in Brazil, a very large country and many different local contexts. One example is, as we've said, something like the Colégio Farroupilha, who've been working with us for many years. And there we see it on the left here, the main framework concept of the 6-level system, which is used at the heart of the framework. Just to remind you here, some key features of the CFR for guiding policy and in setting standards is that it's for all learning, teaching, and assessment professionals. It's there to help set objectives, so the curriculum and the syllabuses. It's there to help guide the teaching or the pedagogy and the materials that are needed, and it's there to measure the outcomes. And therefore, we call it a global reference scale. So not only does it provide the local needs, but it also helps learners and users of exams and so forth to relate the standards to international standards. And that's often important, for example, in mobility or helping people throughout their life when they need to travel or find jobs. So thinking about this at a national level, here, for an analogy, we see a Vietnamese example. This is the Vietnamese Foreign Languages Project. They have adapted the CFR and they call it the CEFR-VN. And as you can see, it's on the left here, it's used for aligning policy goals throughout education, the K-12, if you like, educational cycles, and the progression through that. On the right, you see the Venn diagram at the top with the circles, overlapping circles. So it's bringing together in a coherent way the teaching and learning programs, the standards and the certification. And it also goes beyond school into self-directed learning, and therefore beyond the K-12 into continuing education, vocational sector, higher education, and so forth. So you can see at the bottom right how the whole picture is very coherent, using the framework as the way of talking about it. And it enables long-term planning. Here you see the project initiated in 2008, and this phase is ending in 2025. Interestingly, as you see at the very small letters at the bottom on the right, it is in fact a plurilingual policy, and it covers more languages than just English. Although, of course, as in many countries, English is the main language that is taught in schooling. Before going on, I'd just like to highlight the notion of ecosystems. Your eco is a positive word now associated with green and the environment. Here's a definition taken from one of our dictionaries. All the living things in an area and the way they affect each other and the environment that's there. So that's an ecosystem. It's a rather simple definition from the natural world, but in talking about systemic LOA, we use this as a metaphor when talking about ecosystems of language learning in local environments, as I'll be explaining, and the local environments are your context and the ways that the different parts of the environment fit together coherently. The starting point for us are the various participants who are in their local environments, the context. In your context, that in Brazilian education, the starting point would be the macro level educational policies and so on. But teachers and learners in schools are, however, at the center of our concerns, as represented graphically by the green circle in my diagram at the center here. So I'm going to build up this diagram as a way of explaining it as we go through the talk. I believe that building successful ecosystems of language learning are design concepts. They're about putting things together by having a plan. And so the aim of the plan should be to achieve positive impact by doing it effectively, and to find out if things are not working and then correct them so that they don't have negative impact. So this is rather slow. As I said, schools and classrooms are central. But of course, there are other learning contexts too in our hybrid world, such as online learning, blended solutions, and so on. And they are very much included in this, as I'll come back to later. Macro policies clearly impact classrooms and the behavior of schools and classrooms. So we do need to understand what the policy implications are in order to achieve systemic alignment. Seeking clarity and agreement on common purpose is a crucial, critical activity for all participants. I believe it's their responsibility to seek the clarity and to use the tools that are available to help them do so, as I've pointed out already. If derived from a common framework like the CFR, there are typically recurrent policy themes. Now, that is from Chile to China. You find the same ones recurring, and as we've seen in the Vietnamese example. So a coherent and comprehensive approach to language education that prioritizes learning to help people improve their communication skills from kindergarten onwards and then onwards across the lifespan. So that means for educational purposes initially, but then for occupational and personal reasons, which crop up later in life as well as in school. I'm arguing that the framework and therefore enables a learner-centric approach to be developed, keeping the language learning mission at its core and focusing on the need to make sure that our learners actually achieve a communicative competence that's useful in the real world. So this is an approach that takes a child from primary school to her chosen job or profession. And it's indeed about personal growth a lot across the lifespan. So a young child in Vietnam, growing up, becoming a doctor, and then learning new language skills to help her progress her career as she goes from being a junior doctor, a specialist, or a consultant. For this, in taking this approach. So if it's all about learning, there are other aspects of learning that we also need to take into account, not just the target language, which would be English. Actually, if English is the target language, all of our learners will be plurilingual. They will have their languages from the home or the region. They will be studying through the national language or the language of schooling, and they will be developing other competencies which will help them in their learning in school and beyond. Intercultural competence, perhaps that comes with learning languages, but also things like creativity, engagement, motivation, and well-being. These are all central to learning languages effectively. So what does this look like? How would it work in Brazil, or how does it work in Brazil and other Latin American countries? I think the starting point is to make sure there is good familiarity with the frame of reference and the scales. As it's the main communication tool for harmonization, everybody who is using it needs to have a good knowledge of it and what it can and can't do. Then it can be applied more effectively in local contexts. So if it's to support learning across the lifespan throughout school and so forth, it needs to function, I would say, as a kind of learning ladder to support progression and to make it visible, as we say in Cambridge, every step of the way. So from where you start on the ladder to where you eventually want to get to. So I found actually this example actually taken from a talk by Luciana in 2019, illustrating this learning ladder in the case of Colégio Farroupilha. And I thought this is a nice way of illustrating it. By using the CFR approach, it's not just about the levels or the scale. We can make sure we retain a focus on the high-level objectives related to learning the language for communication. And this is central. So all learning tasks can therefore be designed with this in mind. Of course, the content of the curriculum must be made relevant to target learners in their own context, whether that's in primary school, in high school, or in university. And there may well be differences in Brazil compared with other countries. There certainly will be. So ask yourself, what inspires and motivates your young people to learn languages? One size doesn't fit all. And so this is not an approach which is trying to make straitjackets. In fact, it's an approach which is attempting to, if you like, bring everybody's contribution together so that it is appropriately coherent, systematic, and understood by all concerned. So what about assessment in this system? Well, you're reading this diagram from left to right. We have the frames of reference, the scales. It delivers a learning-oriented curriculum with content and related pedagogy, which then enables you or publishers like Cambridge to develop tasks which are learning oriented, which are appropriate to this objective. And then at the end, we have assessment, or at the right of this diagram, we have assessment. Where does it fit in then, systemically? Well, as I've said, traditional exams sometimes exert negative washback. And too often this is because teachers develop tasks in classrooms that are based on traditional exam formats. So not based on the framework or the curriculum, but based on what goes on in an exam. So cramming, teaching to the test, practicing multiple choice items that are taken from past papers and so on. This is sometimes the negative effect of assessment, what you might call assessment-oriented learning. And I believe this is to be avoided. We have to turn it the other way around. So we have to make sure that the tasks are learning-oriented. Positive impact by design considers the way in which exams and learning tasks can be aligned to the same levels and the same learning objectives as set out on the left of the diagram, in order to develop the communicative competence of the learners and to make sure that that is done coherently and progressively. And this is certainly our aim in Cambridge. So the systemic model is learner-centered, with integrated learning-oriented tasks at the core. And this is a diagram of what I would call the dynamic learning and assessment cycle. You find this in all learning contexts, where the goal of this cycle is to impact the cognition and behavior of the participants, the learners. So we're looking to change people as they progress through their learning journey with the eye on continual improvement. What is systemic here, again, is that the evidence of the learner's current knowledge and skills is produced from their interaction with the tasks, and this evidence is used in various ways to support future and upcoming learning, and eventually to report the outcomes in ways which are understood by the learner, but also by others as well. So feedback on learning to the learner or to others is really central. The important question about feedback or questions relate to the who, the what, when, and how of feedback. And the engagement of learners in their own learning and using that feedback most effectively becomes a critical aspect. So more about this later. So we're arguing that benefits need to be systemic at both macro and micro level. And this was explained in a book I wrote with Neil Jones in 2016. Some of you, as I say, may have seen it and seen this diagram. So what I'll do is I'll just click through this diagram. So over here on the left, we have the learner, and we're trying to impact the learner's cognition, metacognition, knowledge, competency, skills, and so on. And ultimately, that learner will need to use those skills, or as they progress, will be using those language skills in their own life, in society at large. And we're trying to mediate that through our education policy and our assessment policy, which is learning oriented, which seeks to integrate language learning and assessment more effectively. So that red part in the middle is the education assessment system. And we're putting into it our tasks for learning and assessment. So facilitating teaching, helping learning, and providing learning-oriented assessment. So that is, if you like, what we're going about by taking this approach. The benefits for learners, I think, need to be investigated thoroughly, and more research is needed focused on collecting evidence of their learning. The hypothesized benefits are shown on the left here in the yellow box and include visible progress of their learning, more interest, better motivation, and well-being, as well as progression along the proficiency continuum. How we collect and interpret the data to show evidence of such growth remains the key challenge for educators, especially examination providers. But we're on that case in Cambridge, and some of you may already have participated in some of our validation studies or our impact studies that we carry out with participants in their own context. On the right, of course, is the benefits for society and relate back to the macro policies. So improvement in standards and improvement in learning outcomes remains very central to the ambition of policymakers. And if we can connect these two things together, we will get better outcomes, I would argue. So just in order to complete my diagram, we need to ensure that there is coherence from left to right, and that the assessments we use are indeed learning oriented in a systemic way, and do not distort our learning and teaching goals through negative effects. As noted, at the heart of this model are tasks that support language learning in learning contexts, that is the classroom or a learning environment, and they need to be able to support formative feedback to help learners as they're going along. So formative feedback for learning, or progress checking for personalizing learning goals. So we call this assessment for learning. It's another word for formative assessment. Large-scale exams, like the Cambridge ones or others, should be aligned to the same levels and constructs based on the common framework. And if the system is coherent from left to right, then it will be, as I believe is the case in Cambridge. So this is what we would call outcome assessment, high-stakes assessment, perhaps, but it's assessment of learning, which provides evidence and value-added certification, which is used not only by the learner, but is used more widely in education and beyond in society. And I believe it's great when all learners have the opportunity to gain such qualifications. We find it's particularly motivating and highly integrated in people's lives when they get an idea that this is of value to them. Grandparents, like myself, like to see them framed and put on the wall when their grandchildren come home, and this I think is a great thing. So it's up to us to ensure that we make our exams and our certification learning oriented, and that we fit the impact in the classroom and the learning environments in a positive way. So there we are. That completes the diagram, which shows how the framework provides guidance every step of the way for policymakers and practitioners in achieving the positive effects on learning. And if we do it locally in your own school, with your own people involved, I would argue that we do create an ecology or an ecosystem of learning, which makes sure that all of these goals are borne in mind and that these things fit together harmoniously. Some people refer to these as comprehensive learning systems. Another way of representing it is with this triangle, where there's the curriculum, the assessment, and the delivery of the teaching and learning are actively planned and then monitored to ensure that they're delivered according to the way it was planned and with the design, with the positive impact taken in mind. Apologies for the small writing here, but I think this is how I and Neil summarized it. And I think it's quite a good way of thinking about it from the overarching goal or the mission of education right down to how we deliver assessment which has positive impacts and which is useful in societal terms. So school learning takes place within a local community and is a social process. Learning concerns personal development, so dispositions and skills that are key to current and future learning. Language learning specifically concerns the use of language to communicate personally significant meanings, not just ones which are taken out of textbooks. Teaching goals and assessment goals are aligned to specific desirable outcomes, which I've characterized as communicative language ability, but also things such as the ability to learn better, understanding how to make progress, understanding how to assess oneself, for example, are all included in that. Learning and assessment tasks should mirror real-world communication. There should be an overlap and need to have what is called situational and interactional authenticity if they're going to engage the learner's cognition and affect their learning. Evidence drawn from classroom interaction can be fed back to learners to scaffold and promote further learning. So that's assessment and evidence for learning. And records of achievement can be drawn from these interactions and combined with other types of assessment coherently. So you can put together progressively various types of assessment to create a comprehensive record of a learner's current level of proficiency. And of course, the learning ladder is central, and progression in terms of increasing levels of proficiency consistently and across cycles of education and beyond is, as I've said, desirable. So I think that provides a sort of summary of the ecosystem of learning on one page. But there are new challenges which you're familiar with. This diagram summarizes the dynamic LOA cycle, as I've mentioned before, which we use in talking about Cambridge approaches. The positive alignment assessment to support learning, I think, has been hitherto quite challenging in many contexts, but digital technology, I believe, now provides some transformative opportunities by collecting, storing, and helping us to interpret the evidence more effectively within this model. Having said that, though, don't get me wrong, with the increasing use of the technology, I think the role of teachers becomes increasingly important, but in different ways. And as you've heard from Silvana before, with some of these new concepts and with the benefit of technology, there will be the need for the adaptation of teaching practices and therefore the need for new learning about these areas. So in-service education and new courses for teacher training, I would say. Amongst other skills, higher levels of assessment literacy for assessment LOA will be needed. Assessment literacy is about understanding the principles and application of assessment, in this case, for learning purposes. And we, teachers and others, will need to understand how the technology works better in order to take full advantage of the data-driven evidence that an LOA system can provide. So as we move forward, on the left of this diagram in red, we see the future is probably hybrid education, building on the new normal after the pandemic with blended and in-class, out-of-class learning. And increasingly, the need for learners to personalize their learning and to connect their needs more effectively with society and the needs of society. In other words, we need to put learning and assessment together hand in hand, but we will need to do so with the help of technology that's now emerging. And I call this educational technology plus educational AI or various kinds of AI or artificial intelligence, which can be used to help drive this learning cycle. So the challenges here are both technical and social. So including, as we said, in-service and professional development for teachers, but also seeking to build understanding of the need for the systemic model, using the framework perhaps as the tool for communication. Creating a shared understanding is key, I think, if integrated learning assessment is to succeed. And if we are able, and to enable us, I mean, to exploit the technology and the educational artificial intelligence for this purpose. So these are 4 pictures in one on this slide. The goal is to integrate learning assessment by design. The opportunity now exists because we have those things in the bottom left, devices which can deliver or assist us in delivering learning content both in and out of classrooms. They're connected to the World Wide Web, which we used to call it, but we have a whole connectivity issue here that we can take advantage of. And they can also help us to collect the data on a regular basis that can be used to build personalization of language learning and the use of adaptive technologies, which can provide different pathways for different learners more effectively. In Cambridge, for example, we have a whole range of products and services, if you like, which are focusing on integrating learning and assessment by design. Hitherto, we have been assembling our materials and our tests, done this for many years, but this is supplemented by new products such as learning apps, practice apps, and so on. And ultimately, these will be designed from the beginning in, if you like, a born digital way, so the whole thing will fit together more effectively. But you see that the types of assessment here in a learning-oriented model are not just proficiency exams, but all kinds of tests which form part of a learning journey. And in order for them to work coherently, they need to be aligned to the same framework and the same scales and the same understandings of what good looks like when learners are progressing and when they need, and also to help them when they need feedback for improvement or to change the way they're doing things to make progress. So that's the bit about integrated learning assessment. Let's come back a little bit now and think about the tools that are there to help us and return to the CFR 20 years on. You may know that the CFR has evolved in certain ways. It's taken an evolutionary approach. The blue book you saw has not changed, but various new aspects have been developed, which form tools in a toolkit. This is the way it's referred to. So we've had the European language portfolio, several manuals for helping assessment, and reference level descriptions which have adapted the CFR for different languages. And we in Cambridge have developed the English Profile program for these purposes. And as you've seen, the framework itself has been adapted for local purposes in particular. We've got the Japanese version, the Taiwanese version under development, and I've given you the Vietnamese example. And there are others, many more in fact. At 20 years on, I'd like to recommend a couple of publications which are really quite useful with regard to the topic I've been talking about and the topic you've heard about from Silvana and Alberto. The first one is this companion volume. I'm not sure whether this is mentioned before, but it came out in 2020. And it's really useful if you want to revise your knowledge of the CFR and its basic principles. So it doesn't replace the original, but it complements it and extends it in important ways, including, as I'll mention again in a moment, a strong focus on the concept of plurilingualism. Most recently, this year, is this one. It's a handbook which has been published in order to make clearer points about alignment for a wide audience. It's a very useful document, and it's not focusing particularly on assessment, but it's focusing on the various components of alignment as they come together. So that's very much to the point in what I'm talking about today. And it's hot off the press. And you can get hold of it again freely from this tiny URL that's on the bottom of the screen. So I commend both of those to you. The companion volume has updated some of the central concepts of the CFR in this red circle on the right here, taken from a webinar. That's Brian North on the left, by the way, one of the authors of the original CFR and who delivered this webinar and has done a number of publications about the companion volume. Notice in particular, we now talk about 4 modes of communication. This was in the original, but not drawn out and focused on as much as now in the companion volume. So reception and production, interaction, which many of you are familiar with, but now a particular kind of interaction, which is called mediation, as you've heard. And with this shift to these 4 modes, there's also a shift in emphasis towards language as a social process. So translanguaging is a social process. And so language learning is not just a school subject. And it moves the focus on to community events that are effectively integrated tasks, so like involving interaction. And the new version of that, or the newly explained version of that, is called mediation. So rather than separated skills, we see more emphasis on complex scenarios that are typical in social practices involving the use of language in the real world. And that can be the use of several languages in the same context. So this extends the community approach and opens up really exciting new opportunities for learning and assessment tasks of the future. And ones which I think will be facilitated by the technology that our learners are now using on a regular basis. All of this implies, though, that the learner needs to be given more autonomy. This is an action-oriented approach, which was in the original CFR, but it extends the way in which it describes the language learner as a social agent in their own context. I'd take a quick second to look at some of the things that Brian says about it. So the stated goal of this approach is for learners to build up a plurilingual repertoire, starting from the languages that they encounter in their home and in their school, and then adding language abilities in their own context and then in their lives, so that becomes part of their daily lifestyles. Language is a lifestyle choice and not just a school subject. So this contributes to a vision of lifelong language learning learning in the school, but also at home, in the community, at work, and in new contexts as they arise in a squiggly career across the lifespan as people progress in their lives. And I think this is perhaps a re-emphasis on what was there before, with a particular focus on the learner at the center with more autonomy. So I'm coming to the end now, and with this slide, just to highlight what I've been talking about. So the prize, the goal is for our learners to become social agents with a plurilingual repertoire, with the community of competence that they need, and supported, I would say, by us as educators, providing them a coherent approach to integrated learning and assessment, which achieves the goals and the impacts that we want. It will involve the virtuous combination of humans working more effectively with machines, so the handshake there. And this is a challenge for the future. In conclusion, therefore, we will need to design our systems with these things in mind and continually be prepared to adjust and professionalize our practices as we go along. I know my colleagues and I are very happy to engage in this challenge with you in your context, finding better ways to achieve those positive impacts, and particularly those which you and your learners desire in your own contexts. So with that, thank you very much for listening. Let's indeed keep in touch. And if there's still time, I'm happy to take questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you so much again for being here with us. It has been a great pleasure. We do have one question here. Let me just, Alberto asked you, can you illustrate some examples of how AI has been helping? Oh my gosh, I lost it. Sorry. Has been helping impact by design?
Yes. So impact by design is that you want people to be practicing things which lead them to make progress, for example. So let's take the case of your writing skills. Okay. You want to improve writing English. What do you need to do to improve writing English? You need to practice writing, right? Mm-hmm. And you need to do so in ways in which feedback, I mentioned feedback, is given to you in ways in which you can understand what is not working, what you can't do very well, can find some information either from a teacher or from a book to help you work out how to do it better, to practice again, to get more feedback, and continually do this in an iterative way so that you can progress up the scale, as I was mentioning. Well, in order for that to work, you need regular feedback. You can't have, feedback from your teacher once a month. So this is where artificial intelligence can come in, particularly we're thinking about specific types of artificial intelligence, like machine learning techniques and natural language processing, which enables us in Cambridge, for example, to train a machine to understand written language, identify errors, and provide feedback, right? So feedback which is appropriate to a learner at their stage of learning. So this is very difficult to do with humans alone, because it requires a lot of effort to give tasks, receive them back, mark tasks, get feedback, and so forth. What we've done is we have something called Write and Improve, which is a free online tool, which is an example of something which is designed to have the right impact, which is to target the level of the learner, enable the learner to practice and provide feedback which can be acted on, which is available to the learner to make progress. So it gives visible evidence of the errors, but it also helps address those errors. And this is just one example. It can be applied, currently it can be applied to speaking or reading, but ultimately it could apply to mediation tasks or more complex interactive tasks, which people can practice online. And perhaps when they go to classroom, they talk to their teachers about what they can do well and what they can't do well. So the teacher is then more like a coach rather than delivering content or simply explaining grammar. So you see, this is where I think we can take advantage and move forward and do more complex things. But we don't want just the technology to determine this. It needs to be the technology in the interests of the learning. So we need the specialists, the teachers and assessment people working hand in hand with the others in order to make sure that, in fact, the positive impact is that the two things, the learning and our assessment, are hand in hand, dancing hand in hand, happily doing their, a nice little Brazilian dance together.
Great, Nick.
Which is your favorite, Roberta?
Yes, samba.
Samba, okay.
Yes, samba is my favorite.
Learning and
I love
assessment, samba. That's
beautiful
in the Brazilian
samba
context. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. One last question, Nick. What's the most impactful thing about learning in your life?
What's the most impactful thing about learning, or what I've learned?
I think it's about learning.
I was doing French at school from a very old-fashioned book, and then I was probably 14 when I first went to France, and that was the most impactful thing. But we're talking about like 1970, right? We didn't have the internet, so I'd never met anybody who spoke French. It was only when I realized that languages for communication, this is what I've been focusing on in my talk, that I realized that it was worth learning French. I found it quite boring, the way it was being taught. And so you need to connect the interest of the learner in some way, which makes sense.
Wonderful, Nick. Wonderful.
There's a question in the Q&A, Roberta.
Oh, sorry. Let me see. Renan asks, in the past, the theories and approaches would be designed and then used for years and years, mostly unchanged. Nowadays, there is a need for the research to practice to be more integrated and a demand for approaches to be more flexible and adaptable. How do you see the CFR evolving in a world that's being changed so fast by technology and the prospect of Internet 3.0?
Well, I agree that the world is changing rapidly. And my last point was that we need to continually work together to professionalize, to take advantage of this. The good thing about a common framework like the CFR, that it doesn't change every day. It provides a common reference point, as I've indicated, that has evolved in ways which has made it more usable, which has extended the understanding of the concepts. But the thing itself, this is its great strength, has remained a central reference point, which you can use in Brazil in the same way we use it in Cambridge, in the same way they use it in Vietnam. All are somewhat different, but we at least are having a conversation about the same things, right? So the new world is to take advantage of these new constructs, which we are beginning to understand, like mediation, and the new technology, which is bringing together old technology, which is already, 20 years old, with new opportunities. So it is an evolutionary approach, but I think we have some opportunities which are now there, which were not there before.
Yes, thank you. Nick, we have lots of great comments here, people thanking for the talks, and everyone, thank you so much for interacting, participating. It has been, again, a great pleasure to be here with you all today, and having Nick here was amazing. It's a dream for us. Thank you so much, Nick.
Thank you for inviting me. I've always enjoyed coming and talking to you guys.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let me know
we'll
if there's
invite you more often.
Anything you didn't understand or would like to know more about, and I can provide some. Or if you think it's wrong, just tell me, and I'll think about it.
Okay, Nick, thank you so much. Yeah. Everyone, we are getting to the end of this wonderful event. So on behalf of the Farroupilha Open Center and the Escola de Professores Inquietos, we would like to thank you all for your participation and your great interaction during the whole event, as well as the vital support of Cambridge University Press and Assessment. Also, a big thank you to everyone who has worked to make this event happen. And we have lots of people here today. So everyone that was involved during all the meetings and everything, thank you so much. I deeply appreciate everyone, people from Farroupilha, the whole team. And did you know that Farroupilha Open Center is open for CELTA registrations now? CELTA, Certificate in Teaching English to Speakers of Other Languages, is one of the most renowned certifications for language teachers. The course will take place in a hybrid way. The first stage online and the second stage in person in Porto Alegre. So the link for you to know more is in the chat now. So if you need more information, if you are interested in CELTA, please click on the link that is now for you available in the chat. Please take the opportunity to follow Farroupilha Open Center at Instagram and in social medias. The channel is amazing. And to stay up to date with all our news. There are lots of things going on, lots of interesting things. See you around. And maybe next year, right, Lou, with the 5th edition of Cambridge Experience. And see you around, and hope to see you in the next edition of Cambridge Experience. Hope you all have a great weekend, a wonderful Saturday. Enjoy the rest of the day. And thank you again, everyone. It's always amazing to be with you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you all.